chance to grow. Also, the Snark has centipedes, big ones, 6 inches long. We kill them occasionally, usually in Charmian's bunk. I've been bitten twice by them, both times foully, while I was asleep. But poor Martin had worse luck. After being sick in bed for 3 weeks, the first day he sat up he sat down on one. Sometimes I think they are the wisest who never go to Carcassonne. Later on we returned to Malu, picked up 7 recruits, hove up anchor, and started to beat out the treacherous entrance. The wind was chopping about, the current upon the ugly point of reef setting strong. Just as we were on the verge of clearing it and gaining the open sea, the wind broke off 4 points. The Minota attempted to go about, missed stays. 2 of her anchors had been lost at Tulagi. Her one remaining anchor was let go. Chain was let out to give it a hold on the coral. Her fin keel struck bottom, and her main topmast lurched and shivered as if about to come down upon our heads. She fetched up on the slack of the anchors at the moment a big comber smashed her shoreward. The chain parted. It was our only anchor. The Minota swung around on her heel and drove headlong into the breakers. Bedlam reigned. All the recruits below, bushmen and afraid of the sea, dashed panic-stricken on deck and got in everybody's way. At the same time the boat's crew made a rush for the rifles. They knew what going ashore on Malaita meant, one hand for the ship and the other hand to fight off the natives. What they held on with I don't know, and they needed to hold on as the Minola lifted, rolled, and pounded on the coral. The bushmen clung in the rigging, too witless to watch out for the topmast. The whale-boat was run out with a tow-line endeavoring in a puny way to prevent the Minota from being flung farther in toward the reef, while Captain Jansen and the mate, the latter pallid and weak with fever, were resurrecting a scrap anchor from out the ballast and rigging up a stock for it. Mr. Caulfield, with his mission boys, arrived in his whale-boat to help. When the Minota first struck, there was not a canoe in sight, but like vultures circling down out of the blue, canoes began to arrive from every quarter. The boat's crew, with rifles at the ready, kept them lined up 100 yards away with a promise of death if they ventured nearer. And there they clung, 100 feet away, black and ominous, crowded with men, holding their canoes with their paddles on the perilous edge of the breaking surf. In the meantime the bushmen were flocking down from the hills armed with spears, sniders, arrows, and clubs, until the beach was massed with them. To complicate matters, at least 10 of our recruits had been enlisted from the very bushmen ashore who were waiting hungrily for the loot of the tobacco and trade goods and all that we had on board. The Minota was honestly built, which is the first essential for any boat that is pounding on a reef. Some idea of what she endured may be gained from the fact that in the first 24 hours she parted 2 anchor chains and 8 hawsers. Our boat's crew was kept busy diving for the anchors and bending new lines. There were times when she parted the chains reinforced with hawsers, and yet she held together. Tree trunks were brought from ashore and worked under her to save her keel and bilges, but the trunks were gnawed and splintered and the ropes that held them frayed to fragments, and still she pounded and held together. But we were luckier than the Ivanhoe, a big recruiting schooner, which had gone ashore on Malaita several months previously and been promptly rushed by the natives. The captain and crew succeeded in getting away in the whale boats, and the bushmen and salt water men looted her clean of everything portable. Squall after squall, driving wind and blinding rain, smote the Minota, while a heavier sea was making. The Eugenie lay at anchor 5 miles to windward, but she was behind a point of land and could not know of our mishap. At Captain Jensen's suggestion, I wrote a note to Captain Keller, asking him to bring extra anchors and gear to our aid. But not a canoe could be persuaded to carry the letter. I offered half a case of tobacco, but the blacks grinned and held their canoes bow on to the breaking seas. A half a case of tobacco was worth 3 pounds. In 2 hours, even against the strong wind and sea, a man could have carried the letter and received in payment what he would have labored half a year for on a plantation. I managed to get into a canoe and paddle out to where Mr. Caulfield was running an anchor with his whaleboat. My idea was that he would have more influence over the natives. He called the canoes up to him, and a score of them clustered around and heard the offer of half a case of tobacco. No one spoke. "I know what you think," the missionary called out to them. "You think plenty tobacco on the schooner and you're going to get it. I tell you plenty rifles on schooner. You get no tobacco, you get bullets." At last, one man, alone in a small canoe, took the letter and started. Waiting for relief, work went on steadily on the Minota. Her water tanks were emptied, and spars, sails, and ballast started shoreward. There were lively times on board when the Minota rolled one bilge down and then the other, a score of men leaping for life and legs as the trade boxes, booms, and 80-pound pigs of iron ballast rushed across from rail to rail and back again. The poor pretty harbor yacht. Her decks and running rigging were a raffle. Down below, everything was disrupted. The cabin floor had been torn up to get at the ballast, and rusty bilgewater swashed and splashed. A bushel of limes, in a mess of flour and water, charged about like so many sticking dumplings escaped from a half-cooked stew. In the inner cabin, Nakata kept guard over our rifles and ammunition. 3 hours from the time our messenger started, a whaleboat, pressing along under a huge spread of canvas, broke through the thick of a shrieking squall to windward. It was Captain Keller, wet with rain and spray, a revolver in belt, his boat's crew fully armed, anchors and hawsers heaped high amidships, coming as fast as wind could drive, the white man, the inevitable white man, coming to a white man's rescue. The vulture line of canoes that had waited so long broke and disappeared as quickly as it had formed. The corpse was not dead after all. We now had 3 whaleboats, 2 plying steadily between the vessel and shore, the other kept busy running out anchors, rebending parted hawsers, and recovering the lost anchors. Later in the afternoon, after a consultation, in which we took into consideration that a number of our boat's crew, as well as 10 of the recruits, belonged to this place, we disarmed the boat's crew. This, incidentally, gave them both hands free to work for the vessel. The rifles were put in the charge of 5 of Mr. Caulfield's mission boys, and down below in the wreck of the cabin the missionary and his converts prayed to God to save the Minota. It was an impressive scene, the unarmed man of God praying with cloudless faith, his savage followers leaning on their rifles and mumbling amens. The cabin walls reeled about them. The vessel lifted and smashed upon the coral with every sea. From on deck came the shouts of men heaving and toiling, praying, in another fashion, with purposeful will and strength of arm. That night Mr. Caulfield brought off a warning. One of our recruits had a price on his head of 50 fathoms of shell money and 40 pigs. Baffled in their desire to capture the vessel, the bushmen decided to get the head of the man. When killing begins, there is no telling where it will end, so Captain Jensen armed a whaleboat and rowed in to the edge of the beach. Oogie, one of the boat's crew, stood up and orated for him. Oogie was excited. Captain Jensen's warning that any canoe sighted that night would be pumped full of lead, Oogie turned into a bellicose declaration of war, which wound up with a peroration somewhat to the following effect. You kill my captain, I drink his blood and die with him. The bushmen contented themselves with burning an unoccupied mission house and sneaked back to the bush. The next day the Eugenie sailed in and dropped anchor. 3 days and 2 nights the Minota pounded on the reef, but she held together, and the shell of her was pulled off at last and anchored in smooth water. There we said good-bye to her and all on board, and sailed away on the Eugenie, bound for Florida Island. End of Chapter 15, Cruising in the Solomon Islands. Recording by Jim Allman, Houston, Texas.